11 Japanese snipers killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. One man with a mail-order rifle killed all 11, alone. This is the story of Second Lieutenant John George, his mail-order Winchester, and the 4 days on Guadalcanal that changed the way the U.S. Army thought about marksmanship and snipers. Before we get to the first shot fired in anger, we need to start far from the jungle. We start in Illinois. John George did not grow up dreaming of being a sniper. He grew up dreaming about hits, tiny groups on distant paper targets, the kind of shots that make other shooters just shake their heads. By the late 1930s, John was already known in his part of Illinois as that kid with the rifle. He shot competitively, traveled to matches, and took every chance he could to get behind a set of iron sights. At 23 years old in 1939, he did something that put his name in the record books. He stepped up on the firing line at a 1,000-yard match, one of the toughest distances in civilian marksmanship, and he walked away as the Illinois state champion, youngest winner in state history. No lasers, no ballistic computers. Just a man, a rifle and iron sights. At 600 yards, George could put his shots into a group about the size of an orange. At longer ranges, he still kept his rounds in tight, predictable clusters. The key was not magic. It was discipline, breathing, trigger control, reading the wind, doing the same thing exactly the same way, shot after shot, until the rifle's recoil felt like a heartbeat. To most people, this was a hobby. To John George, it was a craft. And in a few years, that craft would stop being a sport and start being the difference between life and death. Not just for him, but for the men around him. When war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, men like John George found themselves in uniform. He joined the U.S. Army, eventually becoming an officer in the 132nd Infantry Regiment. But as he moved through training camps, he watched how the Army thought about rifles. The standard issue weapon was the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, rugged and reliable. A good rifle, maybe one of the best of the war. But it wasn't built for the kind of precision John loved. So before he shipped out, he did something unusual and a little controversial. He spent 2 years of his National Guard pay on a personal rifle, a Winchester Model 70. A high-quality, bolt-action sporting rifle, the sort of thing a serious hunter or target shooter would save up for. He added a Lyman Alaskan scope, modest magnification by modern standards, just 2.5 power, mounted with Griffin & Howe hardware. It wasn't a sniper rifle issued by the Army. It wasn't even approved for combat. It was a civilian rifle, bought with his own money, shipped like any other mail-order package. And that meant it had a sense of ownership, of identity. It wasn't a rifle, it was his rifle. The armorer, seeing the crate arrive at camp, reportedly asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. John's answer was simple: neither. It's for the Japanese. There was just one problem. The Army moved faster than the postal system. By the time John's unit shipped out for the Pacific, his prized Winchester was still sitting in a warehouse back home in Illinois. He boarded a transport with everyone else, watched other men clean their Garans on the deck, and knew that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, his rifle was still in a wooden crate marked fragile. He sent a request through military mail, asking for it to be forwarded. Weeks passed. He landed on Guadalcanal without the one tool he trusted more than anything. By the time the 132nd Infantry arrived on Guadalcanal in late 1942, the U.S. Marines had already spent months fighting for their lives. They had landed in August, taken a half-finished airstrip called Henderson Field, and then held it through repeated Japanese attacks on land, sea, and air. But victory was not simple. Henderson Field might have been in American hands, but the island was not. Mount Austin, a stubborn jungle-covered ridge the Japanese called the Gifu, still bristled with bunkers and defenders. The coastal groves west of the Matanikau River were still full of Japanese soldiers, dug into thick stands of trees. John's regiment arrived just in time for some of the ugliest fighting on the island. They were ordered to relieve the exhausted Marines and finish the job. On paper, it was straightforward. Break the Japanese positions on Mount Austin, Clear the bunkers. Push the enemy out of the groves. In reality, it meant days of climbing, sweating, and dying in a green maze of thorns, ravines, and cleverly hidden fortifications. George's battalion attacked the western slopes of Mount Austin. They fought for 16 days. 34 men killed, close to 300 wounded. When the shooting finally died down and the last bunker fell silent, John George had carried his Winchester through the jungle, cleaned it, protected it, but he had not fired it in anger, not once. The early fights were dominated by bayonet charges, grenade tosses into bunkers, and close-quarters firefights. A scoped rifle didn't change much there. The rifle remained almost a rumor, a curiosity that some men joked about. But the jungle was about to change, and so was George's role. Once Mount Austin was behind them, John's battalion moved toward a different kind of battlefield, the groves and jungle west of Point Cruz. No concrete bunkers, few fixed defenses. Instead, the danger lived high in the trees. Japanese troops who had retreated from Henderson Field and other positions had melted into the coastal jungle. Some of them carried rifles with scopes, Arisaka rifles modified for sniping. Many of them were experts at one thing: waiting. High in the branches of banyan trees and palms, they sat quietly for hours, sometimes all day, watching trails, supply paths, and water points, and then they would fire. Over 72 hours, 11 Japanese snipers operating in those groves killed 14 Americans from the Ahunte to 2nd. The effect on morale was brutal. Men began to hate the trees. They hated the silence above them. They hated filling canteens, hated walking along narrow trails, hated the feeling that any step could be their last. One man was shot while bending over a creek to fill his canteen. Another fell from a simple patrol. One soldier was hit in the neck. From a tree he and his squad had already walked past twice. The bullet came from behind and above, a direction they thought was clear. Imagine the scene. You've been carrying a rifle everyone makes fun of. They call it your mail-order sweetheart. Your captain has told you to leave it in your tent and carry a real weapon. Now you stand in front of the battalion commander, and he asks you one simple question. Can that rifle of yours actually hit anything? John explained who he was calmly. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards. Youngest ever to hold the title. Consistent hits at 600 yards with iron sights. Tight groupings at 300 yards with the Lyman scope. This wasn't boasting. It was his resume. If a standard Garand shooter could keep hits on a man-sized target at a few hundred yards, George could treat that same distance like practice. The commander listened, weighed it. Then he gave George a deadline. Prove it. By morning. If he couldn't deliver, the experiment was over. The battalion would keep doing what it was doing, and men would keep dying from invisible shots in the trees. That night, John didn't sleep much. He cleaned the Winchester again, checked the scope mounts, making sure nothing had loosened in the humid air and rough handling, laid out his ammunition, 30 Aero 6 rounds similar to the Garands, but carefully selected, some of it hunting ammunition he'd brought from the States. He wasn't just going to prove his rifle worked. He was going to hunt the men who had been hunting his brothers. At first light on January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George climbed into the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut and banyan groves west of Point Cruz. No spotter, no radio operator, no security team. Just him, his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the shadows, put the rifle to his shoulder, and started scanning the trees. The Lyman Alaskan scope was not powerful. 2.5 times magnification doesn't sound like much, but in a jungle, that small boost is the difference between just trees and, wait, that branch moved. The soundscape of the jungle is never quiet. Insects, bird calls, far-off artillery rumbling like a storm over the hills. George taught his brain to filter all of that out. He wasn't listening for sound. He was watching for the tiniest motion. At 9:17 a.m. he saw it. Not a man, not a rifle, just a branch that shifted in a sky that was completely still. No wind, no obvious reason for that movement. His mind clicked. 80+ feet up in a banyan tree, around 240 yards from his position, something had moved that shouldn't have. He stayed patient, watched. The branch shifted again, and now a shape emerged, the outline of a man, in dark clothing, tucked in where several branches forked. The sniper was facing away from George, watching the supply trail his men used. He had no idea there was now another set of eyes studying him. George adjusted the scope. 2 clicks for wind. He let his breathing slow, felt the familiar weight of the trigger, tuned to a crisp, light break he'd perfected back at Camp Perry before the war. Then he took up the slack and squeezed. The rifle kicked neatly into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the grove. Up in the banyan the figure jerked, then fell. Branches clawed at the body as it tumbled nearly 90 feet to the ground. First shot in combat. First kill. He cycled the bolt, chambered a fresh round and didn't celebrate. There was no time. He knew Japanese snipers often worked in pairs, a shooter and a spotter. If he'd just killed the shooter, there was still someone up there with eyes and a rifle waiting. He shifted his gaze to neighboring trees. The scope's limited magnification forced him to go slowly, scanning each trunk, each cluster of branches. At 9:43 he found the second man. Different tree, about 60 yards to the north. Lower in the canopy, climbing down. The sniper had heard the shot and understood the danger. He was retreating. George led the movement and fired. Another body fell through the foliage. Another rifle clattered among the branches. 2 shots. 2 Japanese snipers dead. The invisible killers who had haunted his battalion for days were, for the first time, on the losing end. And it was only mid-morning. By noon, John George had killed 5 snipers, each time using the same formula. See a tiny movement. Confirm it's a man, not a branch. Breathe. Squeeze. Watch the body fall. Word began to leak through the battalion. The guy with the toy rifle? He's out there alone knocking snipers out of trees. Men who had laughed at the Winchester now asked if they could come watch, as if it was some sort of grim sport. George refused. Spectators were distractions. Distractions got people killed. He was not performing. He was doing surgery on a battlefield. Around late morning, the fight reminded him he was not the only one out there. A Japanese bullet slammed into a sandbag just 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt and debris into his face. He rolled aside, heart pounding, pressed flat against the bunker wall. The shot had come from a different direction than before. A reminder that just because you're hunting doesn't mean you're not also being hunted. He waited, counting minutes, then crawled back up and used the same method as before. Study the trees. Think like the man at the other end of the rifle. Eventually he found the shooter. Another dark shape in a banyan. Another carefully chosen perch. Another trigger squeeze. Another body falling silently from the canopy. By the end of that first day, as the sun sank and shadows blurred into one another, George had stacked up an extraordinary record. 5 confirmed kills. A handful of misses he filed away as lessons. A growing respect for how smart and adaptable his enemies were. And somewhere behind him, an entire battalion slowly realized that one man and one sporting rifle were doing more against the snipers than weeks of patrols had. The next morning, January 23rd, the jungle woke up angry. Rain hammered the canopy, turning the ground into an ankle-deep soup. Visibility dropped until the trees blurred into a grey-green wall. George took up the same position but could see almost nothing. He waited. At 8:15 the rain began to ease. By 8:45 it was light enough to see shapes again. At 9:12 he spotted another sniper who had done exactly what George would have done in his place. Used the sound of rainfall as cover to climb into position. This man had picked a tree almost 300 yards away, stretching the distance after hearing rumors that someone in the American lines had a good eye. Smart tactics. It didn't matter. George adjusted for the longer shot and fired. Another sniper down. But now the Japanese changed the rules of the game. They were not just going to lose one man at a time. At 9:57, the first mortar shells crashed into the area around George's bunker. He felt the concussions in his chest, heard fragments whine through the air. The first salvo fell short. The second landed closer. He did not wait for the third. Clutching his rifle, he sprinted away from the bunker, pounding along the tree line until he found a shell crater, diving into it just as the next round thundered down. The bunker where he had been lying minutes earlier disappeared in a storm of dirt, debris and shrapnel. The Japanese had triangulated his position. Either by sound, by observation, or by pure experience, they had figured out where their hunters were dying from. The duel had officially become a two-way street. George relocated, choosing another position, this time behind a fallen tree, about 100 yards away. Again he settled in, slowed his breathing, and watched. The day turned into another study in patience and nerve. By mid-afternoon he had killed 2 more snipers, including one who had climbed so high in the canopy that the changing sun created a faint silhouette against the sky. He saw what others missed, not because he had better eyesight, but because he had trained himself to notice. At the end of day 2, his commander called him in and wanted a number. George gave it calmly. 8 confirmed snipers killed in 2 days. 12 shots fired. 8 hits, 4 misses. The commander didn't call the rifle a toy anymore. Instead, he had orders. Rest, clean the rifle. Be back in position at dawn. There were still 3 snipers out there, and those 3 were, by definition, the most skilled. That night, the rain returned. George tried to sleep, but his mind stayed stuck on the same 3 facts. 11 snipers, 8 dead, 3 left. Those 3 had watched their comrades die, or at least seen the consequences. Bodies at the base of trees, empty perches, strange shots from unseen positions. They would be cautious, clever, and very aware of the man with the strange rifle. By 3 a.m., restless, he gave up on sleep and sat in his tent, the Winchester across his knees, listening to the rain. At first light, instead of going back to the same destroyed bunker or the same fallen tree, he made a choice. If he could predict his enemy could predict him. So he moved. He picked a cluster of rocks the Marines had previously used as a machine. Gun position, slightly elevated, with good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. From there, he could see not just into the trees, but slightly down into some of the foliage. The rain finally began to taper off around 7:43. At 8:17 he spotted a sniper, low in a palm tree, just 40 feet up, about 190 yards away. That alone was strange. Most snipers went high, for better lines of sight over the jungle. This man had chosen concealment instead of height, hiding in the thick palm fronds that shielded him from ground-level observers. But George wasn't on the ground anymore. From his elevated perch, he could look through gaps that would have been invisible from below. He could see the curve of a shoulder, the angle of a head. He brought the rifle up, centered the crosshairs, began to squeeze, then stopped. His instincts screamed at him. It was too perfect, too easy, too obvious, especially for someone who had survived this long. He lowered the rifle and widened his search. If that man in the palm was bait, the real hunter would be positioned to watch for exactly the muzzle flash John was about to create. He scanned, tree by tree, methodically. After 11 long minutes, he found him. A banyan tree about 80 yards northwest of the palm, high up, in an almost invisible hide cloaked in vines and branches. From there, the sniper had a clear field of view, not just over the groves, but directly toward the positions George had used on previous days. He was waiting for one thing, for the American sniper to reveal himself by shooting at the bait. George now had a puzzle. If he fired at the real sniper first, the sound would force the man to move, giving him the chance to escape. And the moment George worked the bolt to fire again, his position would be betrayed. If he did nothing, eventually the sniper would realize he wasn't facing the old positions and start methodically searching for him. So he did something clever. He decided to play along. He lined up on the bait sniper in the palm tree and fired. The decoy jerked, toppled out of the fronds. Then, without waiting, George snapped the rifle toward the banyan, staring through the scope at the tangle of leaves and branches. He knew how a man reacts to sudden noise and danger. He waited for it. He waited for it. There, a slight shift. A turn of the head. He took the shot. The real sniper fell. 2 shots, 2 dead men, and somewhere deeper in the grove, other Japanese soldiers now knew exactly where the American sniper had just fired from. George didn't wait to enjoy his victory. He grabbed his gear and moved. Seconds later, a Japanese machine gun ripped into the rocks he had just abandoned, bullets smacking stone and kicking up dirt. The duel was now chess at full speed, move, counter-move, always under fire. George relocated yet again, this time to a shell crater partly filled with muddy rainwater, about 40 yards away. He climbed in until the water reached his chest, rested the rifle on the lip of the crater, waited. He had now accounted for 10 snipers. The 11th, or possibly the last 2, working together, would be the most cautious of all. He scanned the trees and scanned and scanned. At 9:47, a realization hit him like a physical shock. He had been looking in the wrong place. The final sniper wasn't in the trees at all. He caught the movement in his peripheral vision, low to the ground, a shape crawling through undergrowth, using ferns and fallen branches as cover. The man was moving toward George's previous position at the rocks, creeping along what he assumed was John's escape route. George stayed low in the water. The angle was bad. He couldn't get a clean shot without rising and exposing himself. He watched as the sniper inched closer to the rocks, paused, studied the area, and then moved into them, taking over the abandoned machine gun nest. From that vantage point, the sniper faced east, toward the drainage ditch where he believed George had fled under fire. George now had a 40-yard shot at the back of the man's head, an easy shot by any standard. But nothing about this day had been easy. George felt that same nagging doubt again. No experienced sniper would stay in such an exposed position for long, not with an unseen enemy nearby. He widened his search again. Sure enough, about 70 yards northwest, behind a fallen tree, lay another Japanese soldier, motionless except for his eyes, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch, prepared to cover the man in the rocks. 2 men, 2 rifles, a coordinated sweep. If George shot one, the other would have a clear angle to his position the moment he worked the bolt. So he waited. He slowly sank lower in the water until only his eyes and the top of his head were visible. He held the rifle upright to keep the barrel above the waterline, his arms burning from the awkward position. Time stretched. Finally, at 10:13, the man in the rock stood up, apparently convinced the ditch was empty. He signaled to his partner, and both men started moving east, sweeping the jungle 70 yards apart. They passed by George's crater, never suspecting that the man they were searching for was submerged, just a few feet away. When they were clear, George rose. Water poured from his clothes, his helmet, his face. He brought the rifle to his shoulder. The closest man, the one who had occupied the rocks, now stood about 40 yards away with his back turned. George fired. The soldier dropped. He worked the bolt, swung to the second man by the fallen tree, who was already turning, raising his rifle. George fired again. The second man fell. 11 snipers. 11 kills spread across 4 days. The grove that had seemed haunted by invisible death was suddenly quiet. But the story wasn't over. The snipers, it turned out, hadn't been working alone. As George climbed out of the crater and began picking up his spent casings, an old shooter's habit, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. More than one, speaking Japanese. They were coming from the tree line, closing in. He slid back into the water, heart thudding. The new arrivals weren't snipers. They were infantry, a patrol or a recovery team, probably sent to check on the men George had just killed. He heard them gather around the first body, low, urgent conversation. Then they moved to the second. At 10:28 the sound shifted again. Feet in the mud, branches pushed aside. They were not heading back into the trees. They were following something. It took George a second to realize what. Tracks, boot prints in the mud, leading from the rocks to his crater. He had been careful with noise and movement, but he hadn't thought about the footprints he left behind. He had 5 rounds in the rifle. From the sounds, there were at least 6 Japanese soldiers. Maybe more. The math was not good. He stayed as still as he could as the voices drew closer. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the lip of the crater, looking down. Their eyes met. There was no time for subtlety. George fired from the water, the muzzle blast deafening in the confined space. The soldier fell backward, disappearing from sight. George racked the bolt even as water sprayed around him, came up higher. 2 more men appeared at the rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds fired. 2 left. The jungle erupted. Shouts. Rifle fire. Bullets tore into the earth and smashed into the area around the crater. The Japanese shot at movement and sound, not knowing exactly where he was. George dropped into the water again, then scrambled out the far side, running low through the undergrowth. He sprinted to another fallen tree about 20 yards away and dove behind it, lungs burning. More voices, more footsteps. He put the scope to his eye, searching. 2 figures advanced cautiously toward the crater, weapons ready. He waited for a clear shot, then took it. The lead man went down. The second dove for cover. More shouting, more movement, this time from multiple directions. The Japanese were trying to flank him. He had 1 round left. He made a decision that went deeper than tactics. He chose life over 1 more kill. He grabbed the rifle and ran north, away from the crater, crashing through ferns and vines, feeling branches slash across his face, hearing bullets snap into nearby trunks. 90 seconds later, he dropped into another shell crater, this one dry. He waited. The voices faded. The Japanese, it seemed, were more interested in securing their dead than chasing one lone American into unknown territory, eventually breathing ragged. George began moving cautiously back toward American lines. At 11:13, a Marine sentry challenged him. Mud-streaked, soaked, exhausted, he gave his name and unit. He carried a rifle that had 2 rounds left in it, and a story very few would ever fully understand. When George reported back to his commander, he laid out the facts calmly. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 shots fired at them. 11 hits, 1 miss. 3 more infantry killed during the crater fight, using 5 rounds. His ammunition? Down to 2 cartridges. The battalion had taken heavy losses in the weeks before. George had just removed one of the most dangerous threats with nothing more than patience, marksmanship, and a rifle the army hadn't issued him. The story didn't stop at Point Cruz. Word went up the chain of command. Division headquarters took notice. A question made its way down to George. Could he teach other men to do what he'd done? Not everyone could be a state champion, but the army had plenty of good shots. The division scrounged up 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes, leftover sniper rifles from Marine units that had rotated out. They also identified 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen. George was told to form them into a sniper section, train them, and develop tactics tailored to the jungle. He agreed, with one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. The request was approved. In late January, on a rough range a couple miles east of Henderson Field, George lined up 40 men and 14 scoped rifles. On paper, these men were already among the best shots in the division. In reality, almost none of them had experience. Quietly hunting, a single human being from concealment. George had to rebuild them from the ground up. He started with the basics. How to control your breathing when your heart's hammering. How to let your finger press the trigger straight back instead of snatching it. How to read wind from leaves and grass when you don't have flags. The Springfield rifles were heavier than the standard Garand. Heavier even than his Winchester. That extra weight made them more stable, but harder to hold steady in improvised positions. So he taught them to make the jungle work for them. Use a rock as a rest. Use a log. Use a forked branch. Anything to turn shaky muscles into solid support. They fired at still targets from 100 yards out to 400. Then they shot at moving silhouettes. Then at targets half hidden by branches and leaves. By the end of 3 days of range work, 32 of the men could reliably hit a man-sized target at 300 yards under field conditions. George split them into 16 two-man teams, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, responsible not just for finding targets, but for protecting the shooter. After each engagement, they could swap roles, keeping both men sharp and avoiding the one hero, one assistant dynamic that could get a team wiped out if a single man fell. On February 1st, George took 4 teams out on their first real mission. Their job, clean up scattered Japanese groups west of the Matanikau, men who hadn't managed to evacuate yet. From hidden positions, George and a spotter, Corporal Hayes, watched a jungle trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the path. Hayes confirmed. George fired. 1 shot, 1 enemy down. Over 6 hours, they repeated the pattern as targets appeared. 7 Japanese soldiers in total, 6 of them killed by first-round hits. 1 missed because of a tricky wind gust. The other teams reported similar results. By February 9th, this new sniper section had racked up 74 confirmed kills, each one observed, not estimated. American casualties from sniper operations during that period, 0. The snipers had gone from being a nightmare to being themselves a weapon. When George was eventually wounded by a rifle shot to the shoulder near the Tenaru, a serious wound, but not a crippling one, his frontline days on Guadalcanal came to a close. While he recovered at a field hospital, the campaign ended. The Japanese evacuated the island, but the army was not done with him. His experience had put his name on a short list of officers who knew jungle warfare firsthand and who had proven they could think independently under fire. Orders came down. A new unit was forming. Something experimental. 3,000 men. No tanks, no trucks, no big guns. They would march hundreds of miles through some of the worst terrain on Earth, the mountains and jungles of northern Burma, to capture a vital Japanese airfield at Maitkina. They would later be known as Merrill's Marauders. The official name was the 5307th Composite Unit. George volunteered. His official role was as a rifle platoon leader. The army still had no formal sniping doctrine embedded in its organizational charts. But his commanders knew about Guadalcanal. His Winchester traveled with him, again shipped and carried across oceans and continents, now a little more worn, a little more battle-proven. This time, George made changes. Burma was not going to be a series of short patrols from a secure base. It was going to be one continuous grinding movement, with everything carried on your back or on the backs of mules. Every ounce counted. He swapped the relatively heavy Lyman scope for a lighter Weaver 330. Same magnification, less weight. He even replaced the stock with a lighter version, shaving ounces wherever he could. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but when your total load is 60 pounds and you're climbing muddy slopes for weeks at a time, those ounces become real. In February 1944, the Marauders stepped off into Burma. No roads, no vehicles. Just men, mules, rifles, and willpower. They trudged through heat that made Guadalcanal feel mild, crossed rivers, climbed steep ridges. Disease hit them almost as hard as the enemy. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. By the time they neared Maitkina, more Marauders were out of action from sickness than from gunfire. In 3 months, they covered over 700 miles. George fired the Winchester only a handful of times in that entire campaign. Once at over 400 yards, dropping a Japanese officer directing fire near a river crossing. Once to silence a machine gun that had pinned down his men. Once to kill a sniper harassing a patrol from long range. Each time he fired once and moved immediately. The report of his sporting rifle sounded different from the Garan's, and he couldn't risk the enemy zeroing in on that signature. Most of the combat, though, did not favor the sniper's craft. It was close, chaotic, often at distances where the scoped rifle offered no advantage. Ambushes at 30 feet, exchanges at 50 yards in thick jungle, where the enemy is little more than a shape and a muzzle flash. By the time Maitkina fell in May, the Marauders had completed their mission, but they were spent. The unit was declared combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much physical and mental wear. George survived. So did the Winchester, but he had learned something important. The age of the lone rifleman changing the battlefield. With a single well-placed shot was not over, but it was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. Logistics and firepower were taking center stage. Sniping in the future would be a specialized tool, not a way of life for an entire unit. After Burma, George returned to the United States. The Army promoted him to captain, then later he would reach lieutenant colonel. He found himself at Fort Benning, teaching other officers how to lead small units, how to shoot, how to maneuver. The Winchester lived in a footlocker. He rarely took it out. When the war finally ended, he left the military and did something many combat veterans did under the GI Bill. He went to school, Princeton for politics, Oxford for further study, British East Africa for field research on institutions and regional politics. He became in many ways a scholar and a civil servant. In Washington, D.C., he worked with the Institute of African American Relations, then with the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute, focusing on African affairs. In offices and classrooms, few people knew that the quiet man giving lectures had once spent days in a jungle bunker staring at trees, waiting for a branch to move. For a long time, he didn't talk about Guadalcanal or Burma, but he did one important thing. In 1947, he sat down and began to write. Not a memoir of emotions, not a sweeping I was there story. He wanted to capture the technical truth of jungle combat, the weapons, the tactics, the small details that would slip away as memories faded. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to more than 400 pages. When a friend at the National Rifle Association read it, he strongly suggested publication. George was hesitant. It was detailed, clinical, full of jargon about rifles and ammo and ballistics. He doubted the general public would care, but the book was published anyway, under a simple, powerful title, Shots Fired in Anger. It quietly became a classic among serious shooters and military historians, a brutally honest account of what worked in combat and what didn't, told without flashy self-promotion. His descriptions of Japanese small arms and field tactics remain some of the best primary sources on the subject. Meanwhile, wars rolled on. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Gulf War. George watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14, then the M16. He watched sniping develop into a formal specialty, with dedicated schools, purpose-built rifles, and doctrine that owed something, whether they knew it or not, to men like him. John George died on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. By then, his old Winchester was no longer in his closet. It had been donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today it sits in a display case, resting quietly on supports, a simple tag explaining that it belonged to an officer who served on Guadalcanal. Most visitors walk past without stopping. To the casual eye, it looks like any other mid-century hunting rifle. No one would guess that this piece of wood and steel once cleared a jungle of enemy snipers in 4 days when a whole battalion couldn't do it in weeks. No one would guess that it helped prove that a single skilled marksman, trusted and given the right tools, could change the odds for hundreds of men. But that's how history often looks up close. Less glamorous, more ordinary. A man who looked like any other officer, carrying a rifle that looked like any other hunting gun. And yet, together, they helped shape how a modern army thought about precision fire, about skill, about the value of one pair of steady hands in the right place at the right time. John George never tried to make himself into a legend. He wrote his book like a report, not a monument. He took his medals, did his job, and went on with his life. But his story, the real story, is worth more than a line on a museum placard. It's a reminder that behind every standard issue doctrine, behind every piece of military policy, there was usually one real human being under fire, figuring it out for the first time. A lieutenant with a rifle everyone laughed at, until it started tipping bodies out of trees. A man who stared at branches for hours because his friends were dying and nobody else could see the danger. A sniper who never called himself one. So the next time you walk through a museum or see a display case full of old rifles, remember this. Some of those pieces of steel changed lives, and some of the people who carried them quietly changed history. Hit that like button, Every single one tells YouTube to show this video to someone else. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served. And if you want more forgotten, real stories like this, not Hollywood fiction, but actual people who did incredible things, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You're not just watching a video, you're helping make sure men like John George don't quietly disappear into silence. They did their part. Now we can do ours by remembering them.